This time, let's talk a little bit about the idea of the state and the role that the state plays in the political order. So in order to do that, we want to talk about a couple of things. The first thing we need to do is we need to identify what exactly a state is, and I also want to talk a little bit about where the state comes from. And this is really important because we tend to think of the state as being the root of the modern political order. Whenever you think about comparative politics, or if you're looking at international relations, it's difficult to get around the idea of the state as being the center of power. We live in a state-based world. And so we probably need to start off by figuring out what exactly that is or what it means. There are lots of different book definitions, lots of different ways that we can think about the definition of the state. And I personally am not a very big fan of definitions. I kind of favor the idea of concepts. So if we think about the state as a concept, one way to think about it is to say that the state somehow enjoys the monopoly of power or the monopoly of force, that the state is that set of institutions that can legitimately go in and either arrest people or enforce laws or create laws. For that reason, another good way of defining state is to think about it as how we decide freedom and equality, or freedom and order, how much freedom you as an individual citizen has, how equal individual citizens are to one another. A third way to kind of think about this idea of the state is to think about it as being a system of internal hierarchy, or a system of external autonomy, a way of identifying lines on a map, if you will. Now, whichever one of the definitions of the state that you use, there are a couple of important characteristics that you have to keep in mind that are going to be true with all states. In addition to all states having this system of internal hierarchy or bureaucratization, we also generally assume that all states are going to have these well-defined boundaries. I have to know where the United States ends and Canada begins, for example. We also assume that all states are going to have some sense of common unified identity. There is this quantity that is Canadian, or this quantity that is British. And to say that we have a state means that the people who are from that state identify with it. And then we also assume that what makes states special, what makes them unique relative to other ways of doing things, is that states enjoy some level of sovereignty. And we'll talk more about what that means in a second, but basically sovereignty means this idea of independence or freedom from external coercion. And we'll kind of get to that in a second. But before we do, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about where this idea of the state comes from and where we get states. The idea of state, or the system of states that we enjoy today, is somewhere between 400 and 40 years old. It really kind of depends on how you define it. Most scholars, especially international relations scholars, point to something called the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 as the birth date of the state or the state system. To kind of give you an idea, it might help for us to take a look at a map of Europe to see sort of what I'm talking about. So here's a map of Europe from about 1500. And if you take a look at this map, you're going to notice a few things. First of all, notice that for many of the peripheral entities, you can call them countries if you want to, but for many of those entities, there aren't so much borders as there are faded boundaries, to suggest that we don't really know exactly where the line is between where the Sultanate begins and where the desert ends. You'll also notice that some of these countries have names that are a little bit different than the names that we would use today. Many of these are going to be listed as kingdoms or houses or confederacies. Also note that many of these countries are heavily fractured, or many of the countries that we think of today are heavily fractured. So take a look at a country like Germany, or today the modern country of Italy, or even France and Spain, and look at how they're different from how they are today. In some respects, this map is even more complicated by the fact that many of the leaders of these kingdoms were related to each other by birth or marriage. And so some of these leaders not only were kings or queens of their own kingdoms, but were in fact vassals to one another. As such, they could lay hereditary claim to some of their territories. Now fast forward about 300 years, so this is about 150 years after the Treaty of Westphalia, and take a look at how the map of Europe has changed or consolidated through war. This map captures the region at the height of the Napoleonic Age. where states had just entered a renewed era of warfare as a result of territorial conquest and expansion. While the state concept had been around for 150 years, this particular period of European history is important because this is when we really start to develop ideas of modern citizenship, or the idea of patriotism, as a result of the Napoleonic Wars. If you go forward another 100 years, you can see how the map has changed even more. Now we're starting to see the consolidation of Italy and Germany and the consolidation of other powers. Not as many small little city-states or provinces that are kind of existing in France or in Spain. You'll also notice that this is the period just before World War I and World War II. And so we're starting to just begin to see the origins of a new concept called the nation-state, where you not only have these territorial boundaries, but you also have some sense that a state represents a given people or a nation. And we see that in Romania or Greece or Belgium. And you'll see that even more in the map in 2000. And this is a map that kind of represents today. There are actually a couple of changes since 2000. You don't see a country like called Kosovo yet. You also haven't started to see the weakening or the fate of some of the Caucasus region countries like Georgia. So that's a little bit about the state system. And the next thing we're going to want to do is take a look at this question of whether or not the state or the state system is in fact inevitable, or are there alternatives to the state.